I've built already a ton of fun, gigantic and crazy foam blasters in the past, but this one would be different. For the release of Doom the Dark Ages, the devs asked us to bring the legendary Skull Crusher to life. And this blaster is literally a mobile shredding machine that turns demon skulls into popcorn and blasts them into everything that dares to challenge you. Doesn't this sound awesome? And after 22 years of cosplay, this is finally my opportunity to use motors because it has movable parts. I'm also going to install all the lights because LEDs just make everything better. I also totally fell in love with its design because it looks just so crazy, so metal, and as a fan of skulls, I also think it's a little bit cute. And yeah, it actually was also the most challenging project we ever made, but in a few seconds you'll figure out why we struggled so much. And now let's start crafting. Doom the Dark Ages is out now for Xbox, PlayStation and PC and has some pretty insane and brutal gameplay. You are playing the origin story of the Doomslayer, a supermassive guy that not only blasts his way free with completely ridiculous weapons, but also wields a shield this time. This means though that the giant Skull Crusher is actually a one-hand weapon. So let's break down this insanity. And before you ask, we actually got the original 3D model of the Skull Crusher from Bethesda. As you can see, it's basically a portable shredder with 4 moving shafts, 4 skulls inside the magazine, 6 smaller skulls outside and 4 movable flappies at the front. The 3D model looked great, but would need a lot of prep work to be good enough for 3D printing. And since our time was pretty limited, we decided to go with much faster foam smithing instead. Now onto the scaling. The skulls inside are actually human-sized, and this totally works with the Doomslayer. He's a pretty tall guy of 7 feet or 2.1 meter. I'm building the weapon for my own proportions though, and I'm only 1.74 m. So I had to scale down the weapon as well. And let's not forget, it's actually a one-hand blaster. Let's see how this will turn out at the end. After getting a rough idea of the size and functionality, Benny made me a pretty detailed blueprint in Adobe Illustrator. This is actually a great way to figure out the right scale, as we can print out the template, tape it together, cut it out, and see if it's actually too small or too large at the end. I decided to go with 65 cm length since the size of the grip felt pretty good in my hand and I was comfortable enough to hold the weapon in one hand later. Okay, but this was a pretty massive project, and the best way to tackle something like this is actually to do it in little steps and solve one problem after the other. First, I wanted to figure out the mechanism of the 4 shredding shafts. I found this 3D model of a shredder for inspiration, and Benny used an online gear generator to figure out the position and size of all required gears. After throwing all of this into Blender, we made a 3D printed test first. Looked great so far. The next step was to build a box for the mechanism. We used our trusty laser cutter and cut out a few layers of solid MDF wood for the walls. A few 3D printed parts here and there, super glue, precision, and the box could be tested next as well. Since my space within the blaster was pretty limited, I used a small 6V DC toy motor to power my gears. The results seemed to be promising. For the blades, we stacked a few layers of 2mm and 5mm EVA foam. I wanted to keep them pretty simple, but you see later that we should have put more thought into their design. Anyway, at this point it was easy to Dremel, glue everything together, and get some nice looking foam blades. As someone who has never worked with motors, I was already super proud. Now that the moving shredder problem was solved, it was time to build the base of the Skull Crusher. Since I was sure this prop would turn out quite heavy, I wanted to use a more durable MDF wood for the core. Building the Skull Crusher was like putting together a gigantic puzzle that you had to design by yourself with your own brain. Benny drew here every single tiny piece in Adobe Illustrator and did an amazing job on breaking everything apart in a logical way. The grip got here a triple layer of wood by the way, but only with this I was convinced that this construction would be strong enough to hold the upcoming foam build. And as you can see, we already got space for the skulls and the overall shape of the blaster. Let's check the reference of the Skull Crusher again so you can get an idea on where we want to go. My plan was to create a hollow space for the motor, the electronics and the power supply. And to paint everything later, we actually would need to be able to take it all apart again, including the shafts. Strong neodymium magnets are usually a great solution for problems like this. So I used MDF wood for the base again, superglued magnets on, and it did the job. Getting to this point was probably the most difficult part of the project, and now all the foam crafting could finally begin. Benny used his Illustrator superpowers to laser cut me one layer after the other. Now wouldn't it be super awesome if the trigger could actually activate the shredder? Luckily there is a handy trigger switch just for this job. I simply attached it onto a piece of foam and hot glued it into the blaster. This should do the trick. Next step was to cut a ton of high density EVA foam. And before you ask, we actually use a Beambox Pro from Flux. Love this machine. Cutting everything out is only half of the work though. I also had to Dremel plenty of pieces. And I just hate sanding. At least gluing on all parts was very straightforward. Benny did an amazing job on designing all pieces and we basically pushed through one section after the other. Some parts were actually quite rushed. We only had 3 weeks of time to finish the whole blaster. But at this point we were already incredibly proud that the mechanism worked and we just hoped we would figure out the rest along the way. For now we just wanted to finish the base and hide the electronics and all the gears nice and pretty. You know, small steps. Now you might wonder again why we didn't just use 3D printing. Preparing the 3D model of the Skull Crusher for printing, actually printing all pieces even though on 2 machines, and gluing and sanding everything would simply take forever. We're just much faster doing things by hand. Also, I personally really enjoy crafting with foam. It gives me a much deeper connection to my work and it feels like I have more control over the size, texture and shape. Anyway, we were already pretty far and I was super happy with the progress. However, rotating blades weren't enough for me. I also wanted to install LEDs. Adding lights is actually one of my favorite parts in prop making and I always try to squeeze in as many as possible. I worked here with addressable RGB LED strips by the way. Next up, I had to solve another technical issue. My motor struggled with the friction and weight of the shafts and my circuit stopped, became hot and even smelled. This was not good. Shipping new electronics to Madeira would take too long though, so instead I tried to improve my setup. First, I sanded away a little bit of wood to reduce the friction. Then we completely rebuilt the blades out of more lightweight foam and cut them out with holes inside. This way we cut the weight by almost 50%. I also added a massive capacitor to the motor. And after trying all kinds of different lipos, I still went with 4 AA's to keep it simple. But it worked! Gosh, I was so relieved. The motor finally ran butter smooth and without any hiccups. Just had to finish some soldering here and there, attach the power supply and glue it inside my little magnet cave. As you can see, the trigger worked perfectly as well. I was so happy. Just ignore the messy wires for now, I'll fix this later. Now that this was solved, I literally could turn off my brain and keep on applying more foam parts. Benny's brain, however, was smoking from creating this insane puzzle in Illustrator. Poor Benny, please appreciate all the work and effort he put into this crazy project. Okay, now on to the next step, adding the 4 flappies at the front. They might look pretty complicated at first sight, but Benny was able to break them down in basic layers of 5 and 10mm EVA foam. As you can see, we really had to think pretty analytical here and figure out how to turn 3-dimensional shapes into 2-dimensional layers. I then had to sand some edges, glue all parts together, and the first flappy looked already pretty nice. Oh, and by the way, all foam as well as the glue is from Cosplay Shop BE. You'll find all links to the materials I used in the description. All flappies were actually pretty straightforward and crafting them was relatively easy. We just had to make sure they would be movable and detachable at the end. But some 3D printed bolts and magnets did the job. The result looked great and we were super happy. Everything moved nice and smooth and we could proceed with the next part, adding the little skulls on the side. Benny used the original game model as a base, edited it, hollowed it out and 3D printed it with white ABS. After gluing both pieces together, I made a little light test with NeoPixel jewels and as you can see, they were just perfect to light them up. To make sure this plan would really work out though, Benny quickly made a little painting test. He applied a super thin layer of airbrush paint and the result looked very nice. NeoPixel jewels are luckily really easy to wire up, and that's one of the reasons why I love working with Adafruit products. Everything else was made out of EVA foam though. Please appreciate my highly precise foam cutting skills. And after adding a few more details, mounting all 6 gullies was pretty straightforward. Well, except that I had to do it 6 times. Next, I cut a little bit of foam, glued all parts on, soldered all wires together, and the first test looked already pretty good. Luckily, there was this huge tube at the top that would hide my ugly cable routing and messy soldering. This is also made out of foam, by the way. I have them in different sizes and absolutely love them. Perfect. The right side was done. Let's repeat all of this for the left one. And with the magic of video editing, this was finished in no time as well. Oh, and if you're curious, I attached the switch here and the whole circuit run with a Trinket Pro 5V and a LiPo battery. A little bit too much for the job, but it's a standard setup for plenty of my LED projects. Next, I needed some skull ammunition. Benny got them again from the original 3D model, did a little bit of editing and sent the files to our 3D printers. We mostly print with ABS since this material is much easier to glue and sand. You just need some ABS acetone slushy and you'll get the most amazing filler and glue for any 3D print. Also, if you look at the printing times for just one of the upper skull, you might get another idea why we didn't 3D print the full blaster. And this skull was a special one. Benny put quite some effort into hollowing it out again and printed in white ABS. The goal was to light it up just like in Doom the Dark Ages. We had no idea if the wall was actually too thick or too thin for the LEDs, but at least the print turned out really nice. And the first test looked promising. So I grabbed again some NeoPixels, wired them up, and it looked like it worked. And by the way, all skulls got names of course. Daisy, named after the Doomslayer's pet rabbit. Murray, here's Wilson. And poor Bob, since he had to be cut in half to fit into the ammunition box. The Skull Crusher would turn out so metal and I was super excited to finish it very soon. And now that the base build was done, we could finally add all the details next. Let's take another look at the Skull Crusher 3D model. As you can see, it has a ton of tiny rivets, nuts and other thingies. After finishing a mentally exhausting and challenging part, this is the best work step though. It doesn't involve too much thinking, is super relaxing, and I just have to glue stuff on and make a project nice and pretty. As you hopefully see, the difference is quite massive. Benny's job though was way more exhausting, as he had to create hundreds of vector designs for all those details. It might not look that challenging, but it's actually incredibly tedious and you constantly worry about forgetting something. The Skull Crusher is one of the most insane props we ever did, and our schedule was incredibly tight, so mistakes were not allowed. We simply did our very best to finish it as fast as possible. Benny even designed the chains in Illustrator and laser cut out countless of 2 and 5mm foam pieces. Afterwards, he carefully set everything together with toothpicks. We got this idea from Captain Ghostly. It was super smart. And this was the very last detail that was still missing. After 3 weeks of very intense crafting, the foam build of the Skull Crusher was finally done. We were incredibly proud of the result and I just love how it turned out. And if you're curious, the Skull Crusher weighs a total of 2.3 kilos. And now, if you want to learn this stuff as well, just get my cosplay crafting books. I have, for example, one about how to make cool props, how to install LEDs, and how to do like really cool painting with your airbrush on commocosplay.com or on Etsy. You can find them as printed version or digital. They are full of tutorials, really helpful advices, very beginner friendly, and great. Buy my books. And now let's go back to crafting. Finally, I could carefully heat seal the foam with my little heat gun and made sure all the little sanding dust and foam lines were gone. Ready for the next step, painting. Before that, however, I had to take everything apart again. And believe me, we were super worried if the mechanism would still work at the end. But let's not think about that yet, and and tape off the little scullies next. These were supposed to light up, so they required some special treatment. Then came priming. Safety first though. I usually prefer spray-on primers for technical looking projects, and my favorite brand is Gummy Dip. The application is pretty thin, so I needed plenty of layers, but the result is always really nice and smooth. Priming all pieces with several layers took a while, but it was much faster than using a brush-on product. However, we still used Flex Bond to add a little bumpy metallic texture at the end. This way the Skull Crusher would just look a little bit more aged and rough. And finally, it was time to make everything nice and shiny. For the base color, I used Gunmetal Vallejo airbrush paint and made sure I really covered every corner of my prop. Then Benny brushed on a darker gray and dropped most of the paint away again super quickly. This way he created some stains and dirt that highlighted the Flex Bond texture and stayed within the corners. Obviously this step took quite a while, but it gave the Skull Crusher a really nice weathered and metallic look. And this makes such a difference. Afterwards, I added a slight rust effect with a little bit of brown. Compared to Benny, my painting skills are pretty basic, but that's something I could do pretty easily. So far for the base paint job. Next, Benny tried his very best to copy the runes from the original 3D model. And as you can see, he really has super steady hands. Okay, we are getting closer. Now onto the little light up scullies. After freeing them from tape, I had to cover up all the metal parts around them. The tricky part here was to apply a layer of paint that was just thin enough to show the lights, but also thick enough to look solid with the lights off. Afterwards, he added silver highlights super carefully on top, and I think the result turned out really awesome. Now that this was done, only a few less details were left. The chains and foam blades got a coat of bronze and a little bit of weathering on top. Finally, I could seal all painted pieces with a few layers of satin spray varnish. I actually mixed satin and matte to get the perfect metallic shine. Back to our Skull Crusher 3D model. In the reference, the blaster is pretty gory and bloody, and especially the inside of the flappies looks messy. To get the perfect blood effect, I mixed a brush-on glossy varnish with some red and black acrylic paint. I wanted to keep a wet shine once the paint dried out, and this would do the job. Painting itself was really simple. I used a super rough brush and just messed around on the inner flappies, the shredder blades and the area of the skull ammunition. And seriously, this part was so much fun. Some happy little blood stains here and there. Finally, Benny also had to paint the larger skulls. I sanded them super roughly and he covered them up with a texture layer of Flex Bond as well. Next on, they got a few layers of bone white and some darker shades. Benny wiped the paint away again and highlighted the texture of the skulls really nicely this way. Now a layer of spray varnish to prepare the surface for the next step. Applying red bloody paint was a little bit scary though, but he did a really amazing job. They turned out so gory. Now the last challenge was finishing and painting the top skull I called Daisy. This is the skull with plenty of built-in LEDs, and Benny had to be really careful here. Adding the red paint was extra scary since it had to be just as red as the other skulls, but again not too much paint. Plus Benny also covered up the carved-in rune, which had to stay completely free of paint. But once done, Daisy looked really lovely and Benny only had to fix the rune slightly with a thin brush. A little bit of spray varnish and all pieces were finally painted. So far so good. Now let's put everything back together. First the chains. Then I got rid of the motor cover and carefully placed one shredder shaft and gear after the other. Gosh, I was seriously so nervous here. I couldn't wait to see everything working again, but was worried that paint got stuck where it shouldn't get stuck and something would go wrong. But it looked good. The final moment. Yay, the motor ran again. Oh my god, I was so relieved. Now all the skulls, poor Bob, Murray, Wilson and Shiny Daisy got their spot. The flappies were pretty straightforward as well. Everything still moved and flapped nicely. Finally, a little bit of extra red demon sauce at the front and I think we're done. Were we done? Yes, we were done. These were some very intense 3 weeks, but the result looks so good. The Skullcrusher was definitely a very crazy, challenging project, and even though there were some things that we wanted to do better, I think it turned out amazing. The light up skulls, the amount of details, and the mechanism. We were just incredibly happy, but also so relieved that this insane build was finally completed. Wow. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you like the Skullcrusher just as much as Benny and I do. We are really proud of the project. I think it turned out really metal, really cool, really awesome. We're super proud, and yeah, I think this was also a great example that showed that really big and crazy and intimidating projects can be actually broken down into smaller parts, so you do everything step by step so it doesn't look that scary anymore. And yeah, I think this was also a great commercial for getting a laser cutter, because it's very nice, very helpful, and you can also cut everything by hand as well. But I have a laser cutter, I'm not crazy, and I'm thankful we had one. Also, thanks so much for Bethesda for challenging us with this wonderful project. But yeah, Doom the Dark Ages is absolutely amazing. It was super fun to build the Skullcrusher, and if you check out the game, link in the video description down below, you will also find plenty of more awesome and amazing and crazy weapons in the game. It's fun, so check it out. Also, please let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and let me know if you have a project as well you are super duper proud of as well. Benny and I really love the Skullcrusher. We really enjoyed working on it, and I would love to work more with electronics, with motors in the future. But I think first we need a little crafting break. So as always, please like and subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. And thanks so much for lovely Patreons, for the constant support. You're super duper awesome, and see you very soon in the next video. Bye bye!